In this segment of On the Ground, we're in South Africa with Abbas Bilgrami. Abbas has lived in Pakistan. He travels quite a bit to Malaysia. He's lived in South Africa for a number of years. He's also done quite a bit of his education in Canada as well. So he's going to bring a real global perspective to the conversation. He's going to tell us about what's happening on the ground in South Africa during the pandemic, how the country and the authorities went about with lockdown and restricting movement. We talk about innovation in Africa and how that's being undervalued in terms of their ability to deal with the pandemic, and that is one of the reasons why their their infection rate and their deaths are so low across the continent. Is this idea of they're used to these sort of epidemics, natural disasters, etc., that happen on a yearly basis all over Africa. They've been dealing with HIV. Ebola, SARS, malaria, dysentery, TB, for decades in Africa. They still have millions of cases of all of these different diseases. So they're uniquely well prepared for this type of a situation. And, there's many innovative ways they're approaching in keeping it clamped down and flattening the curve. Yes, there may be a case of where their cases are going to rise as we move forward and they move into their winter months and all the other factors that may play in. But so far, African countries are doing a commendable job of keeping the infection rate and the deaths remarkably low. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how the governments are preparing, how citizens are being affected, how the most vulnerable are being affected in South Africa. Abbas will also give us some insights into Malaysia. He does quite a bit of work in Malaysia and visits there quite often, and he'll give us some insights to what's happening there as well. There's a lot of things to consider that we don't see in the West, and we aren't exposed to in terms of the real on-the-ground factors of how things are panning out in a country like South Africa, and he'll give us some insights in some of the other African countries as well. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Should be really interesting. I hope you will also tune in and get value from it as well. Thank you. I'm here with my good friend, longtime friend, Abbas Bilgrami. We met in Pakistan, seems like eons ago, but it actually hasn't even been 10 years, but it feels like so long. Yeah. I haven't seen you since. Abbas is in South Africa. He lives there part-time. Abbas, you live there, or are you there mostly year-round?
I live part of the year in South Africa, Najib, and part of the year in Malaysia. And I do a fair bit of traveling. So yeah, I enjoy both the East and the South.
Well, that'll be good. We'll get your perspective on some different countries, but I'm really interested in what's happening in South Africa and Africa in general. So I want to really dive into that because there's very little conversation in the West about Africa and some of the other countries that seem to be having success in dampening the spread of COVID-19. And there's been a lot of speculation in terms of what's going to happen, and that it's just delayed in South Africa because there isn't enough testing, and that South Africa or Africa in general can expect more than 30,000 deaths. Now, South Africa, let's give it a little bit of background, about 59 million people. Right now, standing at 20,000 cases, less than 400 deaths, which is amazing, considering in Canada here we have almost 6,400 deaths. But we should look at it per million because the populations are different. So Canada, about 168 per million. South Africa, 7 per million deaths. And that's the case across the continent. I mean, the deaths are very low, cases are very low, considering the population of Africa, which 1.3 billion, almost or close to the population of India. But still, I mean, deaths under 1,000 in most of the countries. You've got Nigeria, which has 200 million people reporting very low deaths. You have your neighboring countries, Zambia, Botswana, both reporting well under 200 deaths. What's going on, Abbas? Is it just a case of like the testing just hasn't caught up?
I think a number of reasons, Najib. I think the number of cases that are actually on ground are probably underreported. That's one thing. Leaving South Africa aside, because South Africa is somewhat different to the rest of Africa, and I'll explain why. The rest of Africa is not as exposed to these viral infections. It takes longer for them to get here. So I think we'll probably see a real steep rise as we go in towards what are our winter months, especially in the southern hemisphere. The other thing that you have to bear in mind is that these countries have been prone to a lot of epidemics, and so in some respects they're far more ready and very early on. I mean, South Africa in particular, because of the Ebola virus. I mean, and they have a very good center of the National Institute of Health is extremely well managed and reasonably well funded as well. And they've done a lot of work on viral infections because of the autoimmune issues here in Africa. So HIV has really sensitized these people to a lot of these pandemics. And remember, HIV/AIDS was a pandemic at one juncture. But here in South Africa, they've discovered ways and means and treatments. They've caught up in many respects and have gone past the rest of the world in some respects because they get 100% remission for children with HIV. They get a 100% success rate in that. So you've sort of seen a big improvement in many respects in South Africa.
I talk about that. I talk about that quite a bit. When I'm talking, when I had my interview in Pakistan and India, which are also reporting very low deaths, is that preparedness, right? Is that because almost every year in these countries, some sort of epidemic or natural disaster happens. There's just a readiness for these kinds of these situations. But I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, TB, HIV, malaria, dysentery, which has been effectively abolished in the West. These things still cause millions of deaths in Africa. So you have that. Yeah, you have
malaria. The biggest one is malaria, really.
Yeah, so I mean, so you do have that natural built-in response and I think, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, in the past years, Africa's had to deal with MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. They've had to deal with Ebola, many things, and I think that this is like just a natural readiness of the people. I mean, yes, you can talk about the lack of infrastructure and weak healthcare systems.
Yeah.
But from what I read,
let me tell you about that, because in South Africa, unlike the rest of Africa, and this is what I was going to sort of say, is that you've got to differentiate a lot of the countries, because South Africa, the GDP of South Africa is the highest GDP of any other South African or any African country, as long as you take away crude. Nigeria's GDP in the last 3 years is now greater than South Africa's. But as an industrial base, South Africa has an industrial base. If you look at the amount of power generation, it's got close on to about 50,000 megawatts of power generation. So it's got more power generation capacity than the rest of Africa, including Egypt, including Algeria. So it's a very developed country. It's the infrastructure is world class, banking system is world class, the judicial system is world class, the Charter of Rights here for citizens here is probably the best in the world, and it learned a lot from Canada's Charter of Rights as well. So in many respects, South Africa is very fortunate, and we have a very good president as well. Cyril Ramaphosa has been extremely forthright and forceful in being able to get the lockdown at the right time, and he's been able to level the infection rate off, because they know that going into winter, and July is going to be the month that we're all very concerned about, especially when temperatures go down. That's when this viral infection will be even stronger, because that's when most of your chest infections, most of your cardio infections occur around that time of the year, because you get flus, you get all these kinds of issues. So COVID is going to be far more a problem at that juncture. So they've been preparing themselves. So we're at what we called, they had level 5 for nearly 6 weeks. Then we've been at level 4 for the last 4 weeks now. And we're going to go into level 3 in 1st of June. So that means some university students get back to university, some schools will open up, but they will make sure that they keep a very, very strong handle on it. Western Cape has seen a sharp spike, and so I'm told, in the cases, reported cases of COVID. And that makes sense because the Cape area is where you will see temperatures dropping much sooner than the other parts of Africa because it is the furthest south. So in many respects, I think South Africa has done the right things. They've been very, very forceful, and they've been able to implement these sort of measures. And at the same time, they've been gearing up. I mean, with the PPE and all the rest, we didn't have any of the problems that a lot of Western countries, and a lot of, in fact, what the US had. There was no shortage of PPE, there was no shortage of sanitizer, there was no runs on the supermarkets. There was never a problem here where people were carting off toilet paper, toilet rolls, like as if the world was coming to an end. So we didn't have any of those problems. So in some respects, South Africa has been very, very lucky and very fortunate. And the other big thing is, of course, is that we produce all the food that you need. In fact, South Africa exports a lot of food. So in that respect, we're very fortunate. So yeah.
I know, and you're touching on a lot of the things that I want to talk about. And, one of my whole reasons for doing this on the ground series is, there's so much speculation in the West, about why countries in Africa, South Asia, South America are reporting such low amount of cases and deaths, right? And I want to make sure that we hear from people on the ground. And, so let's talk about commonalities first, because, absolutely, we shouldn't treat a continent as vast as Africa all with the same brush, 54 countries, and there couldn't be a bigger difference than a country, South Africa versus northern countries like Egypt, Morocco, and Somalia, and these countries, right? So absolutely, we'll talk about the differences. The interesting commonality of us is the fact that there is such low reporting of cases and deaths and across these countries that have populations that, dwarf countries in the West. And the reports are always about the poor healthcare and the poor infrastructure and the poverty and the corruption. So I don't think we're giving enough credit to the preparedness, right? Of exactly what you said, of the fact, isn't the whole conversation about flattening the curve? Well, then we should be looking at countries in Africa of how to flatten that curve, because I've never seen such flattening of curve. And absolutely, if you're pushing it down the line, that's the whole point, right, of flattening the curve, is to push the cases down the line, to give the healthcare system a chance to prepare. And to your point, it's already better prepared than it sounds like, because even in Canada, we're having problems with PPE and keeping stocks of that. There is concerns about an overrun in the healthcare system, and we're doing things to control that. The US is obviously, I've talked to people in Louisiana and California, and I'm doing some more interviews all over the country there. Everyone reports the same thing of healthcare is not prepared, PPE shortages, and just very little planning. Right? In Senegal and Ghana, they've been on lockdown since January. Since like the first reporting, they immediately started lockdown. We didn't start lockdowns until March.
Because they take it seriously.
They take it seriously.
They take the World Health Organization seriously. They're not stupid. They've had enough. They've had Ebola just a few years ago. They've had SARS and MERS just a few years ago. They were much more impacted by Ebola, and because of that, travel bans and all the rest happened. But they are prepared. There's another reason too, Najib, and that is citizenry in North America and in the West do not listen to what the government was sort of trying to put out. And remember, these are not nanny states. These are countries where the people could do anything that they wanted, because there's very little governance in issues in that respect, because they just don't have the infrastructure. And yet the citizenry over here has responded to the government's appeal that, look, this is going to impact you. And consider the following, that all the 59 million people in South Africa, 40% of these people are very poor people, okay? So there's a lot of poverty. And yet, despite that, people by and large have listened to what the government has said. Despite the fact that they've had to tighten their belts, a lot of people are daily wage workers. Despite that impact, people have tried to follow what the government has asked them to do. And credit to the police, credit to the armed forces who've been helping out over here. They have not had too many incidents of rioting or looting, etc. Strangely enough, I mean, you sort of see this happening in the US. I keep sort of seeing these images of people sort of saying this is our right to be infected. Well, good luck to you, but it ain't going to help. It's not going to help the healthcare system.
Yeah,
It's
you hit the
really
nail right
unfair.
on the head, Abbas, right? The issue is that in countries like that, South Africa, countries in Africa, and some of these places, like again, what we said, this is a yearly occurrence. They do take it seriously. The citizens take it seriously. You know, a lot of much ado is made about the fact that, you know, countries, you know, I did interviews in Norway and Sweden, the trust in government, and absolutely, the trust in government is much higher in the West, especially in the Scandinavian, Nordic countries, and much lower in places like Africa and Middle East, Asia, for many, many reasons, and we'll get into the history of that. But you're absolutely right. It's not because they don't trust the government. It's because this is a recurring thing, and they know they have to protect themselves. Actually, you know, I feel like, you know, people know that they can't rely on the government, they can't rely on the healthcare system, so they take it upon themselves to protect themselves and their family. And I've heard, and in my research, I was seeing a lot of that cases as well, that people are taking it upon themselves to protect themselves and their households. And if that means that they self-impose a lockdown, then that's what they'll do.
Yep, true. Absolutely, you're spot on. I mean, your reading is right, because over here, you have to sort of manage yourself, because the state can only help you so far. The public healthcare system here is actually in South Africa not bad. The large hospitals are very well operated and very well managed. And despite the fact that their resources are hugely stressed, this is something that I'll tell you, is that some of the research and some of the work that goes on here is world class, despite the fact that there's a lot of shortage of resources. This is one of the ironies of this place, is that despite the fact that there's such a shortage of resources, there is a lot of potential. There's a lot of good research that has gone on over here. As I sort of said to you right at the get-go, HIV amongst children has more or less completely been sort of cured. So that is remarkable, because you see, HIV is an extremely aggressive sort of viral sort of infection, and this is one of the things that they've been able to control over here very well. Now, it's not to sort of say that that has been completely resolved. No, there is still a lot of issues, because there's a lot of poverty, and those issues, the issues of poverty, have still to be addressed. It's 40% of the people that we're talking about who are in very dire circumstances. The government has tried to sort of help them a great deal, and this is one of the good things that they've been looking at. So small businesses are being given, you know, like about $300 million worth of sort of assistance, and it's all been done in a very, very organized fashion. At least in South Africa, it's been done very well. The neighboring countries, what we call the SADC region, the South African Development Community, there have been attempts to help, but not as organized as in South Africa. And in that respect, you know, a lot has to do with the government structures, the ability to be able to deliver on services, etc. Governance is better as well in South Africa by comparison to other places. And you were talking about corruption. Corruption is endemic in Africa. It's endemic in Asia. But in South Africa, at least, it is the exception rather than the rule. Nobody's denying it, that there have been issues of corruption here, you know, since independence. But it is the exception rather than the rule. By and large, if you go to the hospitals, nobody's expecting a handout. Over there, you will get service. Over here, if garbage collection is supposed to happen on Wednesday morning, it will happen on Wednesday morning. If your child goes to school before the beginning of term, they will have their books. So there's a lot of the structures work. So I think it's unfair. I mean, I was reading this article in The Guardian, which you sort of sent me as well, which is interesting because it is overlooked, the successes in Africa. And one of the things is research. I mean, hydrochloroquine, people are sort of, you know, talking about that. It's become a joke. But actually, the Madagascan sort of prime minister, their institute of sort of basically medicine, they've been looking at various herbs. And remember, Madagascar has a unique ecosystem. So they've got some interesting sort of work that's been done on that. And they think that there are some particular sort of remedies that they would like to sort of propose. If it had been said, if this had been said by the President of the United States, people would have picked up on it. This is why I said hydrochloroquine has suddenly become a big sort of panacea for
Well, I mean, he has,
being a preventive.
you know, he
It's
has
yet to be
interest.
proven.
He has interest
Madagascar,
in that
the,
treatment, right?
yeah,
You know,
and the research in Madagascar is very, very interesting, but it's not being given the necessary sort of bandwidth for people to be able to sort of study it. Other interesting thing, Najib, is that in places like Ghana and in Senegal, etc., the testing for COVID, they've come up with alternative testing, because the testing that is being used in the West is very expensive. I mean, it's about $80 per test. Over here, they've been able to do it for less than $10 a test. Now you're talking about something interesting. Right now, the results are about 80% accurate. They want to take it up to about 95% accuracy. That's when they will sort of make that available. Some interesting sort of things about this. There are airlines now looking at that particular test that the Ghanaians have come up with to be able to implement because they know that their scheduled flights will start up again in about 6 to 8 weeks' time. How do you sort of allow people to travel if they're infected? So you will test people before they actually book in to check in. Before they check their luggage. They'll have a test done, and within 10 minutes you'll have your result. And because the cost is only $10, people would be able to do that. Whoever's flying will be able to sort of pay for that. So there's interesting sort of things that are being done here, which again, because we're so Eurocentric, if you'd like to think about it, people don't sort of see the amazing sort of ways of how Africans can deal with the emergencies and situations.
Well, no, I mean, it's totally downplayed. You know, that's why I'm having these conversations of us as, you know, in the West. You know, how could innovation come out of a place like Africa, right? You know, people are in poverty and the education is so low, and you know, we see these pictures of, you know, starving children in the streets, right? How could innovation come? You know, I spoke to someone in California last week, and I was like, okay, so what innovation is coming out of Silicon Valley? You know, what is Silicon Valley doing, right? I haven't heard anything about innovation coming out of Silicon Valley to address COVID, right? So, you know, these kinds of things really, really frustrate me, because you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm reading all of this great stuff that's happening in Africa. You know, pool testing that you're referring to, you know, how they keep the cost low by testing multiple blood samples at once. Right. And then people don't understand, you know, how effective the contact tracing is. So forget about the testing in general. You know, in Senegal and in Ghana, I think I was reading that, you know, the contact tracing has been going on since January as well. And also, you know, which they have to do when you can't totally rely on a healthcare system, they have a system of community healthcare workers and volunteers that are on the ground, that are taking care of people and administering all of the testing. You know, so which isn't as robustly documented as it might be in a hospital or a healthcare center, right? Yeah. So that's what people don't understand, is that in these countries, the realities on the ground are so different. When you have people who, you know, maybe far flung, when you have migrant issues, when you have refugees, when you have asylum seekers, when you have all of these different vulnerable groups, you have to react differently. And you can't just rely on government. You can't just rely on formal systems of healthcare.
Well, it's all true, and people are very innovative, and I think in some respects they have to make do, and that shows the incredible tenacity and incredible resourcefulness of people who have literally nothing, and that yet they're able to survive, and they're very happy. There's the level of happiness. I mean, if you look at their happiness quotient, they're way happier than a lot of people that I'm fortunate that I get to sort of travel to Europe reasonably frequently. I don't see that much happiness amongst them. I mean, even though they're very wealthy countries, etc., these people have nothing, and yet you walk in and they'll be generous. They'll want you to have a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, etc. They'll sit you down and they'll give you time. That is very, very important. So, despite the fact that there's a lot of poverty right across Africa, Africa, by and large, is, I think, hugely under. Uh, people think that they can come in and sort of take away their natural resources, etc. And there's a lot of fake news that is circulated. But Africans are very, very innovative, very, very clever, very intelligent people. They have managed, despite colonial sort of enterprise in this continent, which has raped and looted and pillaged this place, they have managed to still come through in good cheer. They do not hate the white man for the hundreds of years of colonial rule, and some of it was very, very brutal and very ruthless. Yet there are no psychological scars on that. So coming back to what we were talking about, they're very innovative, very, very, give them half an opportunity, and they really go far.
And you and I have both seen this in our travels, Abbas, is that in previously occupied, previously colonized countries, you're absolutely right. Like, they don't wallow in the past, right? Because what's the point of that? You have to move on, and you have to deal with the conditions that are present and prepare for the future. And you're absolutely right. And you hit on something that is so true. Is the individualism, the consumerism, the capitalism, the predatory capitalism in the West is making people very unhappy. I mean, we have the highest instances of mental health and depression and these kinds of issues of anywhere in the world. In North America,
that's an epidemic that is often overlooked.
And it is going to be the true results of this pandemic. I don't, when they talk about, in Africa and other continents where we're just seeing the beginning of the pandemic cases and deaths, well, we haven't even hit the tip of the iceberg of what's going to happen in terms of mental health in the West. But let's leave that aside for a second. But you're absolutely right. I mean, that collectivism attitude in countries such as South Africa and the other places we're seeing the low cases and the low death risk, I think it absolutely contributes to it. I think it contributes to the fact that people just in general take better care of each other and don't just worry about themselves. The toilet paper case you brought up is a perfect example, right? And people don't realize this. At first, I was as confused as everyone else about this weird obsession with toilet paper.
Doing so much toilet paper.
I know, but here, listen to this, Abbas. So you and I don't care because we use bidets. So I'm still on the same package of toilet paper I had 2 months ago, right? So it doesn't bother me, and we have many rolls like still lying around. So that doesn't bother me. But someone I was talking to a friend in the U.S. and he's like I was confused by this as well, this obsession with toilet paper. And then he talked to his neighbor, and his neighbor told him that in their household they go through 2 or 3 rolls a day, Abbas, of toilet paper, right? And I was thinking about that, And
I mean, environmentally, can you imagine what an environmental disaster you are? You're cutting trees down to clean your butts.
Abbas, that's not even the biggest problem. The problem is the low nutritional value of their food. Okay, so this is what this person was telling him. He was telling him, like, listen, man, I have bowel movements, 5 to 7 times a day, 5 to 7 times a day, because the nutritional value of the food that they're consuming and the amount of food that is being consumed in the West, especially in the US, right? The amount of food that's being consumed, plus the poor nutritional value, that you're having 5 to 7 bowel movements a day, right? So let's stop talking about toilet paper and talk about why that is. Why is it the case that people are obsessed? Because if you're having 5 to 7 bowel movements a day, Abbas, you are going to be worried about toilet paper, right? So I was like thinking about this, and so say what you want about the impoverished country, but you're not consuming enough food to have 5 to 7 bowel movements a day.
Well, that's a discussion which is very different to what COVID has to say.
Yeah.
About COVID, etc. But I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, how when you start comparing relatively poor nations against very wealthy countries, and you start sort of seeing that, I mean, in some respects, the poorer countries are more realistic. They're more grounded in many respects. So anyway,
I give this example all the time, Abbas, to people of like the sterile environments that we live in the West. Right? The one thing I'll never forget this. I was in a rickshaw. I was in our car. We're going down a one-way street in Pakistan at dark at night. you know, and there's a rickshaw coming the opposite way towards us, right, on the one-way street, which you know is a common occurrence in places like Pakistan. You know,
What the
and
hell?
so my driver starts yelling. Yeah, my driver starts yelling at the rickshaw driver, like, can't you see the signs? Like, you know, this is a one-way. And the rickshaw driver says, well, you can see me, right? Why don't you watch out for yourself? I'll watch out for myself, and we'll both be fine. And I was like, in a nutshell,
Yes.
this is the attitude that keeps everyone safe. It isn't the science. It's not relying on traffic signals and laws and enforcement. It's relying on each other to be like, hey, man, you keep an eye out for me. I'll keep an eye out for you, and we'll both be safe, right? The government's not going to protect us. The signage isn't going to protect us. What's going to protect us is taking care of each other. And you know, I'll never forget that exchange, because to me, it's like, that is, in a nutshell, the difference between the East and the West.
Sure. True. That is interesting. This is why I sort of said people are innovative. You remember there's a word called jugaad. You remember the word jugaad?
Jugaad? No, I don't.
Jugaad means basically, okay, well, jugaad is a Pakistani Indian word. You go somewhere with something which is broken, okay, and you say, can you fix this? I'll say, no problems. But the word for that, when they'll fix it, is called jugaad. Now, jugaad is actually something. It happens when people become far more able to sort of make do with what they have. Okay, it isn't, you know, it isn't a throwaway society where things are, you know, every season you exchange your phone or you change your clothes, etc. No, you use them until you use a thing until you're not able to repair it. And that kind of an attitude, I think, is a huge thing, because the disposable economy, the throwaway economies of these seas of plastic, etc., these are things that are going to come back and hurt all of humanity. And Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, they make do with what they have. In South Africa, they make do with what they have. So as I sort of see it, it's a fascinating sort of, societal sort of, how should I put it? It's an attitude. And especially amongst, we have a group of people here called the Afrikaner. The Afrikaner were the original settlers who came. They were Dutch, and they were people from running away from religious persecution from France, etc. The Huguenots, etc. These people, when they came here, they had to survive. There was nothing, and that ability to survive has come through. So they're really good with engineering. They're really good with being innovative and creating things. So these farmers who are out there in the boonies, they're able to sort of manage and survive and fix things like they do. And so this is exactly the same kind of innovation that occurs when they're talking about having to deal with epidemics. I've been flying in and out of South Africa for the last several years, about the last 10, 12 years. Because of Ebola, they never stopped testing people traveling in. So you would walk through, and they would have there was a scanner. You have to take your glasses off. It would check you. If your temperature was above 36.7 Celsius, they would ask you to go and check with the health facilities. If you were normal, of course, you could just go through and get your visa, your passport stamp, and you go through. So all I'm sort of saying is they remained prepared. They didn't let things go.
Remained vigilant, right? You know, here already people are complaining about the fact that we might have our temperature checked at the airport, right? It's like, you know, this weird concept of freedom, that freedom means I get to do whatever I want in the West. That's the concept of freedom. I get to do whatever I want. Versus the concept of freedom should be like, we need to take care of each other so that we're all safe and we're free to do that in however we want. And it's the government authorities' responsibility to make sure that the infrastructure is in place so that we can take care of each other, right? And that should be highlighted in the times of a pandemic, right? Is the highlight should be, how well are you prepared to take care of each other and your most vulnerable? I think what we've shown here in the West is that we're very poorly prepared. You know, finger pointing at China because of, you know, they can't keep us supplied. They can't keep us supplied with PPE and, you know, and all the other things that, well, whose fault is it that we've moved all of our manufacturing, all of our sourcing to other countries? all in the pursuit of fatter profit margins for shareholders. Is that China's fault? Is that India's fault? Is
Of
that
course not.
Africa's fault? Whose fault
No.
is that, right? So maybe we should look at, maybe we shouldn't be so reliant on other countries to take care of us. You know, that's what we've elected our government to do, right? We have, you know, we, especially in North America, are the most highly resourced, you know, wealthiest countries in the world,
Yeah.
right? And we should not, there's no reason we should be pointing our fingers at anyone in the case of this pandemic.
Yeah. But you know, this is the tragedy of it all. The incredible amount of fake news and rubbish that is being thrown out there, sort of saying that it's the Chinese, creation. It's complete utter tosh. It's exactly like the Spanish flu. Had nothing to do with Spain. It had everything to do with Louisiana and Texas, and yet nobody talks about that.
Yeah.
And that pandemic hit at least 65 million people died over a period of 2.5, 3 years. Now,
Same with the
this is
swine flu. The
something-
swine flu, CDC in the U.S. on their website clearly state that the swine flu originated in the U.S. You know, and there's still, like, you know, these efforts to blame
China.
Mexico, right?
China, Mexico, you blame somebody else,
Exactly,
but you will
right?
not.
Yeah.
You will not take responsibility for your own. I mean, look, and ultimately, diseases are diseases. They'll happen.
Exactly.
And the other thing that Najib, that I found is very interesting, is that the incredible, because social media, while it's got incredible sort of potential to do good, it has also got a huge potential to create so much mistrust and so much angst and hatred and anger. It's just amazing that, you know, as I'm going through looking at, you know, various podcasts and stuff, you look at the comments in the YouTube sort of feed, and some of them are really Looney Tunes, and one would have thought, you know, somebody should be moderating these sort of places to remove what is patently false. So, I mean, I find the worst thing that is happening, because you see, in Africa, while the level of access to the internet and the level of access to social media and stuff is hugely, it's restricted by the amount of sort of bandwidth available here and the coverage areas, etc. That means that the news that you get is much less problematic than what you would get, say, in the US. Or my daughter has this incredible sort of feed of messages coming through to her all the time. Some correct news, some patently false news. And COVID, specifically, there has been a huge amount of what I would call rubbish, basically, that has been put out. And so there's so much static. How do you sort of see what is true and what is not true? And that is very frightening. The numbers are frightening enough, but the information that is being sent out about treatments, if you do this, it'll help. If you do this, you know, you've got to avoid doing this, that, and the other. And that kind of information is very, very detrimental, I think. And especially those people living in urban areas in South Africa, there is that, you know, ferment of information that is, you know, coming through the ether, so to speak.
You know what the problem though, Abbas, is? The problem is that it's not clamped down upon. You know what I mean? Like, everybody, obviously, it's human nature to point fingers and to find someone to blame, right? So,
yeah.
You know, the case, you know, with COVID-19, right? It's just like, you know, why can't we call it the Chinese flu? It originated in China. Well, first of all, to your point, Spanish flu did not originate in Spain. Ebola is not a people. You know, Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome is not a people, not a person. You know what I mean? Those are regions and areas, right? So you can't call it the Chinese flu, even though even though it may have originated in China, because Chinese are people. So you're effectively blaming people. And people don't even understand the difference between that. Call it the Wuhan flu, call it wet market flu, call it something that pertains to the origin, not the people, right? And this is what, but no one yet, Abbas, has clamped down on that. No authority figure has clearly stated that this is not and will not and cannot be called the Chinese flu. And just made that statement that I just made, that, you know, all of this conspiracy theories that, you know, I read something that somebody was like, it's called COVID-19 because it stands for Chinese originated virus. And this is the 19th time that China has sent a virus across the world. Like, are you insane? You know?
Yes, I mean, it happens to be one of the advisors to the president in the White House. Because, I mean, look, I mean, these things aside, Najib, I mean, the fact of the matter is, let's come back to South Africa, because that was what our conversation was about. In South Africa, we haven't seen the worst of it. It's going to come probably in the next 2-3 months. Government is taking it very, very easy. They are not allowing people to sort of be able to sort of to move freely. We have, we can only go out to get groceries, or if you have to go see the doctor, fill up the car, etc. Essential services are operating. It's only now recently that restaurants have been allowed to open for takeaway orders. So in other words, you can order your food in, but you can't. They're not opening their basically services to people, to the public, so to speak. So the government is taking it easy, and I think that's very, very sensible. So in generally, the government has been very sensible right the way through. I wish, the UK had done this, because the UK has seen a huge impact on the entire society. I mean, they've really not sort of been fair to their healthcare system, which is now hugely overloaded. And then, of course, you have the other extreme, where now, as in Pakistan and Bangladesh, elsewhere, they've just removed all restrictions. And in one day, I believe in Bangladesh, I was speaking to a colleague of mine in Bangladesh, infections have gone up by, in one day, 7,000 people were infected. That's a huge, scary thing. In Karachi, my daughter tells me that they opened up opened the restrictions up, and the spend just before Eid was over 33 billion rupees. That's a huge amount of money that was spent, and no social distancing was done, and so therefore infection rate just has spiked. Hospitals are full. The Arafana hospital is turning people away and sort of saying, "We don't have the beds for you." This is the alternative that you could have had. So South Africa is hugely, as I sort of see it, fortunate in having strong leadership and as governance system which works at least to be able to protect its citizenry.
And let's talk about some of the negatives, Abbas, because when we talked about the innovation, the preparedness of South Africa and African countries, but let's talk about some of the negatives. So I'm hearing that schools are reopening and that there's, a lot of pushback because, the infrastructure in schools in terms of water, sanitation, overall just building infrastructure is not in place for distancing, not in place for any kinds of protocols, and that people are very concerned that it's too early to start reopening the schools.
I think there's a lot of truth in what people are concerned about, but I think they've put in place reasonably good protocols. The protocols, as I was saying earlier, the National Institute of Health are extremely savvy. They've had to deal with a lot of issues in the past. For South African institutions, just to give you one example, it's a very crude example, but before you can go into a supermarket, they have wipes to clean, so you can wipe down your shopping trolley, so that it's clean. And before you're allowed in, you have to basically hand sanitize yourself. And then at the checkout counters, social distancing, there are marks put out there. You have to follow that. If you are encroaching on anybody else's area, you will be asked to sort of stand back. This is something that is going to be implemented in schools and universities as well. And this is what I was saying to you, that universities are being opened up, but not all, not everyone's going to be going to the universities in one go. So they're going to be staggering it out. So I think while the criticism is fair, I don't think it's necessarily going to be poorly managed. I think there is an awareness that if they don't control it, it can lead to a huge, there can be a huge blowback. Schools, small, for primary schools and mid schools, and those institutions, managing those will be far more difficult, and that is where I fear. Children always bring back infections to their parents. That is a place where you could sort of see some issues. But I don't think that's going to be anytime soon. I think it's going to be at least another 3 to 4 weeks before they stagger those schools back into operation. I suspect it'll be dependent a great deal on how the government is able to control the spread of the virus. Because as I was saying, in Western Cape, which is one of our provinces here, the infection rate has spiked, and that is of concern. So while the rest of the country is at level 4, and in June 1 will go to level 3, they may regionally maintain level 4 for a while longer. So these are things that are being talked about. But there are issues. Now, I'll talk to you about the problems that exist. As a remnant of apartheid, okay, a lot of the people in the townships are black or Indian, brown people, or colored people, okay? The facilities over there are not as good for supply of water or sanitation, etc. And those are the places, because you see the shanties, the easiest place for them to be able to sort of, if somebody's coming from the rural area and they need to sort of build a house, or they want to sort of live somewhere, they just sort of put up a shack. And land encroachment and shanties in those areas, the government has tried its best to be able to provide sanitation, to provide water, to provide electricity, etc., to these communities. And where they're not able to provide in other words, sewage treatment, etc., or sewage pipelines, etc., they basically put up chemical toilets all over these communities. This is unique. It's not the same throughout other parts of Africa. For me, I've lived in Bangladesh and Pakistan and India, Sri Lanka and Malaysia, elsewhere. I've traveled these places. You don't see this happen in shanties. There's no garbage, in a sense, collection. But here, there is a desire to sort of keep these places clean. Now, it's not to sort of say that it's all perfect. No, there's a lot of theft of power. Cables are stolen all the time. So because copper is expensive, so they sell the copper. So there's a lot of that kind of issue, but it has to do with poverty. It has to do with, education. So I think there are problems, and one of the things that is a serious issue, which I think hasn't really been properly addressed, has to do with the poverty that is in the society, and that poverty is a remnant of a colonial heritage that the South Africa has received. And despite the African National Congress, which has been in power now since independence, trying to do its best, it's not enough. They have to do a lot more. Madiba's basically desire was to build 2.5 million houses, etc. A lot of houses for people. It didn't happen, therefore you got a lot of shanties. The ability to deliver has been stymied because of corruption. The ability to deliver has been problematic because of petty politics, etc. Ramaphosa has come through a huge and troubled time because the previous president, Jacob Zuma's times, there was a lot of corruption that took place in what we call state capture. And those things, there was a genuine decline in terms of service delivery and governance. But during this new president, things have improved somewhat. But he's been under attack as well, because there's people who within the party and outside the party whose interests are different. But look, there's always been pressure groups, there have always been stakeholders who have particular interests. I suspect South Africa will come through COVID. It'll be a very, very, I think a quarter of the population here are hugely impacted by this. The unemployment rate will just skyrocket, because here there's about a 10-12% unemployment rate is actually a low rate. You're going to sort of see at least a quarter of the population being unemployed. That will have an impact on society, because because of that, there will be incidents of criminality, there'll be incidents of rioting, etc., etc. Those are problems that happen, and that's when people can't feed their children, they'll go and sort of steal. So these are the kinds of things that happen, and this is what I was referring to in the townships and the shanties, etc. These are people who have not been uplifted socially, like a lot of the people who are in the urban areas, who are very, I think, privileged. I mean, they live the life of somebody in the first world. Everything works here. But for those people who live in the townships and in the shanties, it ain't so nice. So when you
What is
compare
the
them to
government
people
doing
living
for
in
those people, Abbas? What is the government doing? You know, here in Canada, we've put in a $2,000 a month sort of stipend for everyone to help in gaps in employment and in to help financially. So, you know, the other thing that's interesting about South Africa is that you have a very large population of asylum seekers, refugees, that come to South Africa. Also, too, I mean, it was interesting to read that South Africa has a large LGBTQ population in the refugees and asylum seekers because they come from the other countries where they're not accepted and they're
it's illegal. Yeah,
exactly
yeah,
right.
it's illegal. I mean, Zambia. If you're gay in Zambia, you know, you're in trouble. Uganda,
So what is the government
then
doing
you're
for
in big
both
trouble.
instances? What is the government doing for their most vulnerable, and what is the government's approach to assistance and support? You know, it was interesting to read in India when I was talking to someone on the ground there that, you know, they had taken the approach of first taking care of the most vulnerable and the middle class, and was kind of left to take care of themselves. So what is South Africa's approach? Is it an approach to take care of small business? Is it an approach to take care of the most vulnerable first? Is it an approach to take care of the middle class? What kind of support and financial packages have they put together, and what's their strategy?
In terms of, I mean, I won't give you numbers because I'll give you the general sort of the thrust. I mean, initially, the government had put up about $300 million worth of funding. The private sector, Oppenheimer family, they put up about $150 million as well. So, I mean, a lot of money is being put up towards small businesses to look at SMEs, because SMEs are the backbone of this economy. For the government is basically does provide income support for the most sort of vulnerable, but it's very, very nominal. Remember, $2,000 is a lot of money. Over here, I mean, it may not, you may think differently, but over here, you're lucky if the government is able to give you support of between $400 to $500. I mean, that's a lot of money. Okay, $400 to $500 over here is a lot of money. The government is also ensured that if you are renting from somebody, during this time, the government has basically insisted that nobody will be dispossessed from their homes. So that is something that is there. So it's a kind of a assistance. But the fact of the matter is that implementation of that is patchy. By and large, people have been sympathetic, but there are people who will not be sympathetic. So that's the other problem. And I mean, for instance, I'll just give you essential services that are being provided. How they're doing it is that they're rotating staff, because not everyone's able to come to work. So they're rotating. So people are only coming in 1 week in a month to be able to say, for instance, take care of gas stations. So that means their ability to be able to make income for the 3/4 of the time is restricted. Then the other problem that has been there has been the ability to be able to get to work, because public, transport, while the government has allowed it, they've been very concerned about social distancing. But private sector transporters don't care about those things, but they've now enforced sanitizing taxis, etc., ensuring that people don't sit next to each other, etc., etc. All of that, the police does try, but it's a real struggle, especially as you're going to start seeing the restrictions being reduced. Income support from the government is one of those things that has been a real issue, because the ability to deliver has been problematic, because not everyone is in the banking system. A lot of people are paid cash. Those people are the daily wage workers that I was talking to you about. They're the ones who are the hardest hit. People who are working in construction sites, people who are working as landscape part of landscape companies, etc. Those people aren't allowed to sort of come out to work. Those people cannot come. Essential services, those people are allowed. All of these other people who are considered to be non-essential services, you're not able to come out of your homes. So there's a lot of stuff where there's a lot of problems based around that. I think people have survived, but the long-term impacts of this will be felt for at least another year to 2 years, if not. So I think we haven't sort of started seeing the social impacts of this, which I suspect we're going to see in the next 8 to 12 weeks. So industry, by the way, I mean, ports have started operating because there's a lot. South Africa is an exporting country because they export a lot of minerals, export a lot of food products, etc. So that the government is basically allowed to start operating again within about 4 to 5 weeks since the lockdown started. So other than food and fuel, the rest had been stopped. Now exports have been allowed as well. So mineral exports have started happening too. So ports are operational. So at least that labor is employed. And remember, the state is a major employer in this country. And therefore, the government has continued to pay people their salaries, etc. Nobody's had a cut in those salaries, etc. However, large state-owned enterprises like South African Airways is basically in receivership now. And a number of other state-owned enterprises are hugely challenged because they've been poorly managed, and like all state institutions in a public sector enterprises, they're normally the places where politicians like to put their grubby hands in and steal. And that's what happened during Jacob Zuma's time, that there was state capture. So we're going to sort of see a lot of the weaker state-owned enterprises basically going into receivership. And one of them is actually the power utility, which used to be just about 15 years ago, was one of the best power utilities in the world. Today, it's nearly bankrupt. So COVID is going to impact, I think these already sick enterprises. So that's in the state sector, but in the private sector, South Africa's got a large industrial base. They manufacture automobiles. They manufacture a lot of. They produce enriched minerals, etc. They produce a lot of steel. There's a large infrastructure over here for industry. Okay, that is also got a big problem too because of China's rise. What we were talking about earlier, a lot of manufacturing has moved from here to China and to elsewhere. And that's been one of the major sort of shifts because it's moving from being an industrial economy to becoming a service economy. And that's been a painful sort of change. But South Africa will continue to be a resource supplier. So in other words, minerals, the mining industry will remain a major sort of source of employment. But with the global economy tanking, and I think we're going to go into a depression globally for at least the next 1.5 to 2 years, South Africa will be hurting because mineral mining will be one of the things that will suffer. And that's one of the major areas of employment. So I think you're going to sort of see a lot of hurt, a lot of suffering. The government can only do just so much. I think society will have to step in. And this is where I wanted to sort of add something. People, by and large, have been very generous. I'll tell you that I've seen from different parts of society, civil society, people have come forward and been helping people, whether it's providing food, whether it's providing shelter. The government, by the way, has done a lot of work for shelterless people. They have made the army has provided shelter, very reasonable shelter.
Abbas, thank you for sharing all of that insight into the industrial and the commercial and the economic situation in South Africa. you have any, you're pretty well traveled. You've been going back and forth to Malaysia. You've lived extensively in Pakistan. Any insights what's happening in those two countries?
I'll start with Malaysia, where I spent a lot of time the last 3 years. Malaysia is interesting in terms of it's for a country of about 28, 30 million people. GDP is about the same as South Africa. So it's a very rich country again, and fairly well industrialized as well. In terms of, it's no longer a middle-income country. It's moving towards being defined as being a developed country. And I think by 2025, they want to sort of consider themselves to be a developed country. Mahathir's plan was about 20 years ago that 2020, Vision 2020 was the program that by 2020, Malaysia would be a developed economy. And sure enough, it's moving in that direction. I mean, if you go there, world-class infrastructure, their world-class sort of financial institutions, they weren't, as like South Africa, they weren't actually badly hurt in the last economic meltdown because they weren't hugely leveraged, etc. Malaysia's been able to handle the COVID crisis in a far more organized fashion than a lot of other countries did. I think they've been able to, what they call through the Movement Control Order, MCO, they've basically had very, very rigorous restrictions. Initially, people didn't sort of, comply with the restriction orders, etc. Then they sent in the army, and sure enough, people then started complying. This has meant that they were able to flatten the curve and also reduce a lot of the infection rate, especially by stopping international sort of travel. In fact, just to sort of give you an idea, their civil servants will not be allowed to travel until the end of the year. So January 2021 is when people will be allowed to travel if you're a civil servant in Malaysia. So they've already made that quite clear because they've seen ahead and sort of seen that this is going to be an impact on the whole of society. So they're already preparing for that. Industry has suffered a great deal. I mean, some estimates are that the country's lost nearly about 10%, if not 15% of its GDP, and that's a huge amount. That's that's a serious hit to the local economy in Malaysia, and similarly in Malaysia as well. But I don't think these two countries are alone. The rest of the world is also suffering as well. Malaysia will come through this because they're very fortunate in that they have natural resource. They have gas, they have crude, they have palm oil, which a lot of people in North America don't like because of the soybean lobby, but that's a discussion for another time. But they also have a very, very industrious workforce. So they produce a lot of high-tech sort of components, etc. So Motorola, and Eastgate and a lot of the Microsoft sort of related sort of hardware, software sort of manufacturing is basically done out of Malaysia. A large number of Japanese firms have their offices in Malaysia as well. So Malaysia has got very good social indicators, and in the industry that I'm involved in, which is primarily in the energy sector and in the logistics side of it, it has one of the highest sort of KPIs, so the key performance indicators. So it is really, in some respects, way ahead of other countries in the region. So if you look at Indonesia, Thailand, other than Singapore, Malaysia's ability to deliver on whether it's projects, engineering projects, whether it is to deliver on large infrastructure projects, whether it is the ability to be able to roll out certain programs they are world-class in that respect. And their education system is very, very impressive. The healthcare system, and especially in the COVID, is also very impressive. And despite the fact in the last government, they also had a prime minister who was, shall we say, somewhat kleptomaniacal, but the current regime and the regime before them were people who I think are genuinely trying to get their financial house back in order. I have a lot of respect and regard for them because they're peaceful people and they basically live within the law. And that's saying something for a lot of countries that I've lived in. They are, for me, South Africa is very different. Over here, it's much bigger, wide open spaces. Peninsula Malaysia is very small. You can drive north to south within about, 12 hours from Johor Bahru to right up to, Bukit Kayutan, which is the border on Thailand, etc. So, I mean, it's a small country, and they've been able to manage it very well.
Yeah, no, and I can attest to that too. I mean, I was in Malaysia in 2012, and I was very impressed with the infrastructure, especially public transportation in that country, and just the general ability for people to move around. I mean, I saw so many young people on scooters, young girls on scooters driving around, which I thought was quite impressive. And so, and they accomplished that, within a generation, which is also something really interesting to note that, Malaysia went from being third world conditions to being quite developed within a generation.
That's right. And Najib, the key thing in all of this is I think it's a very, in some respects, a very liberated society. It's not a paternalistic society. So women are, I think, in many respects, emancipated in Malaysia, unlike a lot of other countries. By the way, it's the same thing in South Africa. There's a lot more emancipation over here than in other parts of Africa. But coming back to Malaysia, I think there's a lot to be said about the Malaysian model. They have their flaws, they have their issues, etc. But it's a country that generally works and works for its people. So I think they will come through, but right across the world, I think there will be a shift. There'll be a lot of working from home, or there will be businesses that will be set up where you don't have to commute an hour, 2 hours to get to work. And the workplace will also become, I think, in some respects, irrelevant. That is something that is going to be, there's going to be a change. Same thing with education as well. I think the way that education is delivered there's going to be a rethink about that. There's a lot of, I believe, there's a lot of changes that are going to come in industry. And one of the things that you and I have just discussed is the desire for countries to ensure that they have an industrial base so that they can be less dependent on other countries for their goods and services. And I think this is not a bad thing. And in that respect, South Africa and Malaysia are well ahead because they have an industrial base. They can be able to take care of their needs in a much, much greater way. Malaysia, unlike South Africa.
Okay, Abbas, I'm gonna start wrapping up because your internet for the last 10-15 minutes has been quite poor for the last 10-15
So a lot of it has.
Your internet has been quite poor for the last 10-15 minutes, so I'm going to try to wrap up here.
Okay.
So because we're not getting, your image has been frozen.
Okay, no worries.
Do you want to just, okay, hold on, I'm going to just pause here for a sec. Hold on. Abbas, thanks so much for sharing all your insights on South Africa and Malaysia as well. I didn't give you a chance at the beginning to talk about your background and your credentials and the work that you've done. Maybe you can just give us that before we wrap up.
Sure. I was born in Pakistan. Did my schooling there, but and then in the UK. But I lived in Canada for a long time, and that's where I did my university education, and then I did my qualifications there as well. So, and then I worked in Canada for a number of years. But I was interested in particularly the energy sector and logistics, basically. And so I spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I worked there, did a few projects in Pakistan and in Bangladesh and in the region. And that's been the area that I've really been particularly interested in. Subsequently, then I did a a law qualification as well. But those are all things that I did at University of Cape Town, and the other qualification, my university education was at Concordia and at McGill. So that's my background. Worked at Deloitte in London, worked in the city, and but I wanted to, after working in industry, I wanted to sort of do my own thing. So I came to work with some investors from the UAE in the US, managing their investments, and managing their investments then ultimately in the UK. So that's been my background, and currently right now, what I'm doing in Malaysia is that I'm helping develop a port over there, and we're hoping to build an energy hub which will have the facility will be able to land hydrocarbons and stuff and deliver power, clean power, hopefully using natural gas to Malaysia and southern Thailand. So those are the projects I'm involved in over there. But in South Africa, I live here because my family live here. My family's been living here since independence, and I'm looking at projects here as well. So I have a very what is called a regional master gas plan for this region. So I'm advising a local sort of company on that. So that's my background, Najib, and what I'm doing these days.
Thanks so much for spending the time with us, Abbas. Great insights into what's happening in South Africa during this pandemic. It's unfortunate that the internet, obviously it's evening now in South Africa, so there's a bigger load on the internet and other issues. So hopefully we can revisit again. Let's try to maybe revisit again in a couple weeks, a month or so, and maybe we'll try to do it morning time or during the daytime in South Africa, so that the internet's reliable. Have a great evening, and thank you so much for spending the time.
Thank you.
And I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Absolutely, Najib. All the best. Bye-bye.